Hello, my name's Tom Lorenzen, and welcome to Interesting People. The name of our program, it's being filmed here at the Chabot Los Positas Community College District, and at Chabot College in Hayward, California. The program is based upon the fact that there's interesting people everywhere, all around the country, all around the world. You don't have to be famous. You're just a person who contributes a lot to our society. Tonight, in the program here today, we're going to have an interesting guest, Dr. John McQuaid, and we're going to talk about the Department of Veteran Affairs in general to begin with, and in particular the delivery of medical care and health care to veterans, and particularly in the area of psychological matters for veterans. And the Department of Veteran Affairs is now a cabinet-level position. That was done by President Reagan in the about 1986, 1987. It was moved to subcabinet to cabinet level because he felt it was important to give the veterans that type of status within policy-making, decision-making in Washington, D.C. And with that, I'd like to introduce my guest, Dr. John McQuaid. Hello, John. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to be here.
And I want to start off a little bit. We're going to get into the subject of post-traumatic stress disorder and the difficult subject of suicide. But to begin with, I'd like to know a little bit about you. Tell the audience here about how you got into this profession, where you went to school, and how you ended up becoming Dr. John McQuaid.
All right. Well, thank you. You start by saying you're interested, want us to talk to interesting people. So that's going to be a testable hypothesis. So hopefully this is interesting to folks. So I grew up around here. I grew up in Marin, up in the Bay Area. I was actually born in Michigan, though, because my father was in the Air Force, and he was stationed in Michigan when I was born, and served his career. He served 30 years in the Air Force, most of that in the reserves, but as a JAG officer, so basically a lawyer within the Air Force. And so I was kind of around the military issues from my birth. I went to school in Marin and then went to UCSD down in San Diego for my undergraduate degree. And while there, I actually volunteered at the VA Medical Center in 1986 or so, or 87, as a research assistant to a study that was working and addressing depression and substance dependence amongst veterans who were being treated at the San Diego VA under a wonderful mentor, Sandy Brown, who gave me a ton of support. And that got me interested in both psychology and serving veterans.
So you've got military blood in your background from your dad, and how did your dad became a lawyer, and how did you get interested in the area of psychology? What motivated you to go in that direction?
Well, I used to joke that I wasn't that good at math and I didn't like to write, but I like talking to people. So I thought, well, maybe I'll do psychology. But the ironic part is I ended up doing research where I did, tons of statistics and I wrote papers and stuff like that. So that took me off. But it's just a curiosity about people was the starting point. How to understand what people are going through, how to be supportive. I think our family has always had a focus on service, how to be of service to others, and have a career that would be. And as I got to know what psychology was, beyond just sort of the initial implications of being a therapist, but that psychology is a discipline that explores, that trains you to be a scientist, and how to ask questions and how to generate new knowledge. That got very exciting for me. So I was particularly interested in how people think and behave, and I really enjoyed learning how to question and understand that, but then also to develop new ways of supporting people, treating people, providing care, and then testing whether or not that worked, not just assuming it worked, but actually having the scientific background to determine what's going to be most effective in helping people make change in their life.
Now, with your title, Dr. John McQuaid, explain to the audience, myself, about is it a medical term, an academic term? Is it a hybrid? What is it?
So a psychologist is a PhD, so it's not an MD. And so what a PhD generally implies is that you've been trained as a scientist, and to get a PhD, you have to have completed a doctorate, which means you have to have completed a dissertation, which is a generation of new knowledge. So a research study that has created new knowledge. Mine was basically focusing on the role of stress in depression, and particularly relational stress, and how that predicted course of depression. In addition, it is a clinical degree, which means it is involved in caring for patients or serving. You learn how to provide care. And so when you complete a degree in clinical psychology, you have to both do 4 to 6 years of training as a scientist, basically as a researcher. And you also do, and during that time, you'll be doing what are called practica, which are experiences where you learn how to be a therapist, or how to be a person who's experienced in neuropsychology or testing, or kind of all that range. And then after you've completed your coursework and your dissertation, you also do a year of practical training, what's called an internship. So I went to UCSF. So I did my PhD actually at Oregon after my undergraduate, and then I went to UCSF and did a year as an intern, where you learn, you spend full time being a clinician. And then I spent another postdoctoral year after I completed my degree and was awarded my degree, doing additional training before going on to my career. And then as a psychologist, people think of psychologists as therapists, but I actually have done a lot of research in my career looking at how to test the effectiveness of treatments, and also done a lot of teaching. So in addition to being a psychologist in a VA healthcare system, I'm also a professor right now at University of California, San Francisco.
And it appears to me you have a good sense of empathy. Is that a critical component you feel to move into the world of psychology and be a practitioner?
Well, I hope I have a good sense of empathy. I think there's a lot of range there, but there's a great work by a psychologist named Bill Miller, who actually created a new model of psychotherapy called motivational interviewing. And a lot of what Bill's research has been about was what makes a good therapist. And one of those key components of really what helps therapists be effective is empathy. And other, ability to listen, ability to connect. But across different types of therapy, if somebody's empathic and a good listener, seems like it's not rocket science, but those are core components across any type of therapy that help a therapist be more effective.
I see. Now, when you finished your PhD, then where did you start your career at? Did you start with the veterans, or did you start elsewhere?
My entire grown-up life has been serving veterans. So
wow.
I went back to San Diego and back to the same VA where I volunteered, and started as the director of a mood clinic, a clinic for treating depression, in 1995, I believe. And so that's where I started. So I've been in the VA since 1995, so going on almost 30 years. And I was in San Diego for 13 years. Then I moved to San Francisco VA for 13 years, and now I've been at the Palo Alto VA for the last year and a half or so.
Can you provide the audience and myself with sort of a basic overview of the Department of Veteran Affairs when it was created, really from a historical standpoint, and how its infrastructure is, what areas of focus they have, and so just give us a sort of a brief overview on that.
Sure, happy to. I should say I'm speaking personally. I'm not representing the VA today. I'm just this is, as we said, we're talking about my perspectives on this.
Sure.
The VA historically, we've had benefits or services for veterans since the Revolution. Throughout the history, there's been pension programs and things, even very early on. And the earliest really formulation of the VA as it's now incorporated really came after the Civil War, where you saw that states created veterans homes. So Togus, Maine was the first veterans home, and Togus, Maine is actually now still a VA medical center. in this country. So that was I believe, the 1870s or so that they started the veteran home model. In our area, Yountville is a beautiful veterans home. Started in the 1890s, I believe, 1880s or 1890s, to serve both Mexican-American War and Civil War veterans. And that was sort of the origins. Then after that period, as you went through World War I, there was a number of different agencies within the federal government and state governments to support veterans and to have benefits. And the VA administration was kind of developed during that period of time. But the VA, as it currently is instituted, really came together after World War II under Omar Bradley. And he was responsible for the structure. The VA now, and as you mentioned, the VA is now under cabinet level agency. The VA now, as it's structured, has three major components. There's the cemetery component, so for veterans who've passed away, or service members who've passed away. There is the benefits component, and then there's the healthcare component. And I am in the healthcare system, and and so most of what I can talk about today will be healthcare. But the benefits include things like who receives compensation for injury they had during their service, who has access to vocational rehab services or educational benefits and those sorts of services. So we're here at Chabot College, so veterans who use their GI Bill, for example, that will all be coordinated through the benefit service. And then the healthcare service is, of course, providing a broad range of medical and healthcare services for veterans.
Well, thank you for that. And when I was regional director for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, I had a chance to visit the Yountville campus there for the state, and I had never been there. And I was really surprised to find out, and I didn't have responsibility because under my role at Health and Human Services, but I did want to learn and know what transpired there on the state level. And I was really flabbergasted when I found out there were Civil War veterans that had been served there in Mexican War, as you said, and there were some are buried there too. Yeah. And I was just really amazed. I had no idea that states did that. Now, the first one was in Maine.
Yep.
Now, did all 50 states? Well, there weren't 50 states at that time, but there were 48. And
yeah.
Do most states have state-run veteran centers as well as on the?
You know, I will have to say I don't know for sure because, as you mentioned, the veterans' homes, even though Togus became a federal facility, veterans' homes are run by the states, right. And I don't know kind of what each state provides. I would assume so, that they have their state veterans resources as well. I mean, every state has a veterans benefits that they provide. And I believe all states have VA healthcare services in them as well.
Sounds good. Well, John, we're just going to take a brief pause here and for a public service announcement, and then we'll come back with our conversation here.
Great.
How you holding up? Nothing wrong with getting help.
If I promise to look into it, will you drop it and help me build this fence?
Now you need my help.
If you or a veteran you know needs support, don't wait. Reach out. Find resources at va.gov/reach.
Welcome back to Interesting People. My name's Tom Lorenzen. I'm the host of this program, and my guest today is Dr. John McQuaid from the Department of Veterans Affairs on the federal level. John, I'd like to go on a little bit now into the area where you have your responsibilities. And can you explain to me and explain to our audience the sort of an overview of what the Department of Veterans Affairs does in the area of medical care, health care, et cetera, from a broad perspective?
Sure. Well, I'll do my best. So I serve at the Palo Alto VA as the chief of psychology, so I particularly know the mental health side, but I'll give sort of this breadth. The VA has about 170 medical centers throughout the country, and that throughout the country, including in Hawaii, and we also have a couple thousand clinics and other locations. So when I'm talking, in this case, I'm talking about healthcare, VA healthcare. Mm-hmm. There's and that includes actually locations in Pacific Islands such as Samoa and Guam, and even in the Philippines. We have a clinic in the Philippines. And so we provide probably the most extensive healthcare system in the, well, not probably, definitely the most extensive healthcare system, coordinated healthcare system, integrated healthcare system in the country. We provide the full range of health services from preventive healthcare through initial primary care, then specialty services, hospitalization services, and then rehabilitation services. In mental health, we provide a full continuity of care from what we call PCMHI, which is primary care mental health integration. So when a person comes into their initial primary care visit, there's mental health providers available if a person's having mental health needs, general mental health care, and then specialty service. For example, we'll talk a little bit about PTSD down the line, but services for treating PTSD, services for treating substance use disorders, family therapy. We have specialty in what's called polytrauma, which is when folks have had both head injury and mental health needs and maybe physical injury, so multiple traumas occurring simultaneously. There's no system better in terms of providing care for veterans with those experiences. Spinal cord injury services. And then in the mental health side, we have specialized compensated work therapy to help veterans who have serious mental illness be able to return to work. We know that work is one of the most important aspects of healthcare and mental health care. And then when there's a need, we have emergency room services, and we have inpatient services, extended residential services, housing for veterans who are unhoused. That's been a massive national target for years, ever since Secretary Shinseki made zero unhoused veterans as a target goal for our system, and we've been working very hard on that. So, I mean, I can kind of go on and on, but we are really the largest and most successful example of an integrated healthcare system, probably, well, certainly in the country. I mean, we probably rival anything in the world in terms of like national health care.
Interesting. When we had talked before, you referenced a book, and I know you're a good advocate of the services provided by Department of Veteran Affairs in the area of healthcare and medical care, et cetera. A book titled Best Care Anywhere by Philip Longman, and about the views that he expressed in that book about the services provided by the Department of Veterans Affairs and the integrated care system, which you reference here a little bit. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that book and why? I mean, all systems I know have imperfections.
Sure.
But why do you feel this is such a good system, the VA system?
So I think the term integrated really is the key. And Philip Longman, when he was originally writing that book, had said, he described that he had gone around and asked people about he was looking for the best healthcare around. And he was surprised that people kept referring him to the VA, because the VA's reputation has not been that great. And there have certainly been major challenges in the VA, there's no doubt. But when it got down to the brass tacks, people would refer him to the VA. And the reason the VA is such an exceptional healthcare system, in my view, is that because of the nature of the ability of the providers to coordinate care for a veteran, it reduces errors, it improves outcomes, and it allows us to make sure that we're meeting a veteran's needs at a holistic level, rather than like targeting one item at a time in a vacuum. Now, why does that matter? So let's think about what I do. I provide mental health care. So I treat veterans who have, I particularly specialize actually in depression and anxiety. I also, of course, serve veterans with PTSD, substance use dependence, and so forth. But that's not all a veteran, all a person is. That's not just the one thing. So if my veteran has a concern around back pain, I have, because of our electronic medical record and our ability to communicate, I have immediate access to experts and providers who can support that veteran in getting specialized services for that back pain. I have the ability to get them connected to someone for housing needs. The ability for me to get access to housing needs is really exceptional compared to what I see for my colleagues in the community. And there's great efforts in the community as well, but the ability using our electronic records and our integrated system to make those connections more timely and more efficiently is unparalleled.
So it's the way you describe it, it's a very holistic system then, and very person-oriented towards the individual. And from the time they enter the system, in a primary care basis, shall we say?
Yep. Which is ironic when people think about the image Williams has of a bureaucracy, which,
And I've been a part of that. So.
But in fact, we can be very individualized in the services we can provide. Now, there are some services that are harder to provide, and the other thing that's really been expanding in the last, let's say, 10 to 12 years is access or supporting veterans to use their benefits in the community if needed. So that's particularly important for veterans, for example, in rural areas where we may not have the ability to have a specialty provider or services in that particular tiny town. But the other thing the VA has done is been a national leader in telehealth. Long before the pandemic came, my staff, we were required to make sure all of our staff were trained in how to provide telehealth services. And so that was, and again, because we needed to be able to meet veterans where they're at. We were trying to make sure we had the ability to get them access to care. So when the pandemic actually arrived, we were in a better position than a lot of systems to be able to provide care for veterans via telehealth.
Oh, that's fascinating. I hadn't thought about that. I worked on a project over in Guam, and they were having serious problems there with their system regarding mental health. And I remember in doing some research, there was a discovery that telehealth, that somehow it seemed to actually improve working with people as opposed to person, particularly since the difficulty where Guam's way out in the Pacific Ocean near the Philippines. Tell us about more about telehealth and its adoption and implementation within the VA, and also electronic health records. When I was at the Department of Health and Human Services, and we were moving more rapidly administratively, plus to comply with mandates by Congress to have electronic health records used. We always used the VA as a key model. Tell us about how that came about and this whole use of technology by the VA.
Well, great. And I want to just reflect on your comment about your experience in Guam and actually, technology sometimes facilitating rather than being an obstacle. And we've had exactly that same experience in the VA. And it's really kind of neat. In fact, as I mentioned, we provide services in Guam, and we'll do a lot of that by telehealth. Of course, you need to have people on the ground as well. So you had kind of two questions in there. One was about the telehealth and one about the electronic records. I'll start with the electronic records just because that's one of the places where the VA has been an incredible leader. When I came into the VA as a staff member in 95, we were just in this transition to really having all of our medical records electronic. And when you think about the issue of paper records, there are so many problems with them. One is, people joke about doctors' handwriting. It's not a joke. You see my handwriting. My handwriting is terrible. There's just that translation in terms of being able to, the legibility. Paper is easy to lose or easy to damage, and then to be able to actually review a chart, you have to order the chart from a file room, have it delivered to you. You have to be able to review it and be able to then get it returned to the file room so that it doesn't get lost. As the VA transitioned to this electronic record, a file that would take me, I'd have to prep to order it and so forth. It's now at my fingertips. And I'm able to make sure I've checked in on what the needs of my veteran have been, and I can have almost instantaneous knowledge of what just happened. If the veteran has been served in another setting, I'm able to see that right away. I'm able to document, I'm able to place orders or consults for additional services all through this electronic system in a vastly more efficient way than was available with paper records. There's clear science that demonstrates that electronic records save lives and improve care dramatically. And so that's part of the excitement. And the VA got this started. Part of what was interesting, and again, I mentioned that you mentioned Phil Longling's book, this was a bottom-up effort within the VA where VA doctors who were really interested in improving care for their veterans started developing computer programs for tracking and recording and providing care. And that morphed and developed into the most comprehensive electronic record system at the time in the world. Now, the VA's record, and so that's, 30, 40 years now that's been in place. The VA right now is in the transition to a new record system that is being created and being implemented. And so we're in this transition point. But because the VA had created this record system, that really drove other industries, other healthcare systems to adopt electronic records as well. And so it really led to what I suspect we all experience now, where we go in and we're, filling out forms electronically and we have access through the web to our providers and so forth. That all got sort of driven by the VA. And so I can go on to the telehealth, but I don't know if you want me to pause there.
Well, I'm just a little, that's good. Let's go to telehealth then, because there's always been a chronic problem getting medical care in rural parts of America.
Yeah.
And out to the South Pacific, to Guam and places too. Where do you see telehealth going within the Department of Veteran Affairs from a broad standpoint, medically as well as psychologically?
So I think it will always be a core tool, but not the only tool. As I mentioned, the VA started implementing telehealth services. When I was in the San Diego VA, so back in the early 2000s, we were already starting to embrace telehealth as a resource. And mental health, my area, is particularly amenable to it. There was a number of wonderful VA researchers who were actually, at that time, doing studies to determine, was telehealth as effective for mental health care, for example, for treating PTSD, for example, as face-to-face visits. And finding that there was doing what are called non-inferiority studies and finding there was no evidence that one treatment was less effective than the other, which is really pretty critical. We need to actually have the science that says this isn't doing harm. And it's been VA researchers who have been real leaders in that field. And so as we were getting that research, one of the other nice things about a big system like the VA is they were able to start providing the technology and the equipment and the infrastructure to be able to administer telehealth. So we initially were doing telehealth from site to site. So it was if a veteran couldn't get to a major VA, they would go to a clinic in their community and then do telehealth back and forth, back when the technology was less robust. Now, of course, we all can do technology based on, from our home. We've all been doing Zoom meetings forever and stuff. And so now we do meetings directly to veterans' homes. This is going to be a key tool moving forward. And I think our big challenge right now in the VA is determining when is which option best. A lot of times it's really a 6 of one, half dozen of the other. What's the preference of the veteran? It's fine. So I currently run a group for depression, which is face-to-face. I've also run groups which were virtual, and I have run groups that were hybrid, where we had some veterans in the room and some veterans remotely. Each one's a little more complicated, and at the same time it gets veterans access to the care, and each has its strengths and weaknesses. So the key is just making sure staff know how to implement those technologies and how to capitalize on the strengths of them. And so we're doing a huge amount of training for providers. We make sure they understand the technology. The other thing that comes up with telehealth is safety, right? I mean, so I work, and we're going to talk maybe about suicide in a little bit. When a veteran is at higher risk for suicide or self-harm and they're in a remote location, we need to have a plan in place to make sure how we're going to support that veteran if they're in crisis. And so when you implement things like telehealth, you have to have plans thought through about safety, crisis management, and so forth, and not just for suicide, but sort of like health events and things like that. So one of the nice things about being in the VA is we have extremely well considered and thought through policies and procedures how to support veterans when they're in crisis and they're in a remote setting.
That sounds quite fantastic, actually. Now, John, we're going to take a brief pause here for a public service announcement again, and then we'll resume in a couple minutes here back to our program.
Great.
You know you don't have to wear your PT gear anymore, right?
It's comfortable.
How's civilian life treating you?
It's fine.
When I got out, I didn't want to admit that there was anything wrong because I felt like a failure. And then I realized, there's nothing to be ashamed of. So I started talking to someone. Maybe you are fine. If you're not, it's okay.
Thank you.
If you or a veteran you know needs support, don't wait. Reach out. Find resources at va.gov/reach.
Welcome back to Interesting People. My name is Tom Lorenzen. I'm the host of the program being done here at Chabot College as part of the Chabot Las Positas Community College system. And my guest is Dr. John McQuaid from the Department of Veterans Affairs. And John, in going back to our subject here, we're going to go into some of the more difficult things. But I want to just follow up on with one more question. We were talking about the use of technology and the overall implementation of care by the Department of Veterans Affairs. And you talk about the integrated system within VA. What about externally with medical schools and academic institutions? To what extent does the Veterans Administration integrate with those entities?
That's a wonderful thing to bring up. I appreciate you highlighting it. So when the VA in its current state was structured in 1947, part of that model explicitly arranged for the VA to be partnered with academic affiliates throughout the country. So San Francisco, for example, is partnered with UCSF. Palo Alto with Stanford. I was at San Diego with UCSD. And there's three huge benefits from that. The first is that you have faculty who are also staff at the VA providing care. Folks who come to Palo Alto VA say, realize that they're having care from Stanford faculty. That you're getting the same care if you went to Stanford. Same with San Francisco and UCSF. So you're getting the best care and best providers for your veterans through that. The second thing is that it provides education to the nation's medical trainees, and they work with veterans in terms of the service, so that it expands the opportunity for those folks to get training by participating in the VA. But it also leads trainees to want to serve veterans. And so 70% of the folks in the VA have been trained at the VA, of the providers. And something like 70% of all people in the nation, like in medical school, I think it's about 70%, have had some sort of VA training. So it's a huge resource for expanding our medical care services throughout the country. And then the third huge benefit from that is these are all major research institutions. So you have researchers who can support improving the care that the veterans get. So I've been involved in research all my career, and we've done studies that have improved the services specifically for veterans, and as well as benefiting the society as a whole. So that partnership has been really central to what makes the VA a special place.
Wow, that's good to know that you're so tightly involved with all the research too as well. John, we're going to move into now some difficult subjects regarding what goes on at the VA and with the people you care for. And that's a matter of public concern too. And a term that emerged in our nomenclature some years ago and gets a lot of attention now, and that's post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And this is an area of particular importance to you and expertise. Can you tell us a little bit about when this awareness first emerged in the community of what this is and how it got described and sort of the evolution of it?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Happy to. Trauma has been with us since humans existed. And in terms of thinking about it in relation to a disorder, early conceptualizations, from World War One, where you talk about shell shock, and World War II, where you talked about combat fatigue. There was a recognition of the mental health consequences of being at war, and that was a big part of actually why mental health was so central to the development of the VA and after World War II. But PTSD, as we diagnose it now, really came out of the Vietnam era, where we'd had the experience of veterans returning, having their lives really kind of falling apart in relation to the experiences they've had and having a difficulty time reintegrating into society, and seeing these symptoms of having intrusive memories with flashbacks, is kind of the image, or really avoiding and isolating and separating out and disconnecting, those sorts of symptoms. That diagnosis came out of the Vietnam era, and then that has continued to be reviewed and revised as we get a better understanding of those symptoms. And it's really this recognition that extreme traumatic experiences, which could either be, personal injury, being actually injured yourself or attacked or feeling like you are an injured, or witnessing traumatic events, having these significant impact on mental health. And so that's a big focus for us in the VA.
With your integrated care system and primary care included, then are they on the lookout then for individuals that may be experiencing it and
Yep.
then try and pass them on to your program and
Yep.
things like that?
In fact, every veteran who comes into a primary care visit will be screened for a number of different risk factors, and those include depression, substance use disorders, PTSD, suicide risk. And so we actually do screenings at least annually for those disorders. And then if a veteran is identified as having some symptoms associated with PTSD, that person will be referred to a mental health provider either in the same day at the primary care visit, or for follow-up if that's not convenient for the veteran or they're not interested. And then that will determine what level of care is necessary.
What are the symptoms that they look for to try and identify it? I mean, do individuals bring it up themselves, or does a primary care doctor or somebody identify, I think you're having some issues? How does that work?
I appreciate you asking that. One of my areas of early research actually was on how to identify mental health needs in primary care, because in fact, people don't bring it up. People don't share a lot of times. I spoke with a World War II veteran who had been at Pearl Harbor and hadn't shared that he'd been at Pearl Harbor until he was about 90. So folks don't share. And so we explicitly ask, and we will ask about a bunch of symptoms. The screenings are a little more succinct, but the symptoms we think about are, has there been a traumatic event? We certainly want to know about if that's happened. Don't have to explain it in the initial sessions, but has there been trauma? Intrusive thoughts like flashbacks, intrusive memories. Avoidance, somebody isolating, trying to separate away. Distortions in cognition, so kind of beliefs about, I'm horrible, I'm disgusting, worthless, or really distorted ways of viewing oneself in the world around them. And then arousal is a common one with PTSD that we want to look at. So physiological arousal, hypervigilance, that's a sense of kind of always being on guard, feeling very easily activated. And these are all common symptoms that really come out of the nature of responding to traumatic events. And so veterans will often say, look, this is not a disorder. This is kind of how I survived. And this is, in fact, how people survive in combat. You have to be hypervigilant. You have to be paying attention. You have to be, distancing yourself from emotion at times. So a lot of these symptoms that are in the diagnosis are functional in those contexts. And that's another thing that we try to understand.
Are there degrees? If somebody's identified then as having post-traumatic stress disorder, is there a degree, like a 1 to 10 scale or anything like that, to say the degree of intensity?
Sure. I mean, we've got a number of ways we measure, and severity will range from very, very mild, and people are highly functioning. Because I think one of the key questions for any mental health disorder for it to be considered a disorder, it has to be impairing you in some way. It has to not just, I mean, people have symptoms all the time in their lives. But is it getting in the way of living the life you want to live?
Okay.
And so that can be one measure of severity, right? I mean, the person who's, still working, still in a relationship, but has some symptoms is in a different place than somebody who's homeless, isolated, living away from people, not able to care for themselves, right? So there's a big dimension there. And yeah, we have a number of scales for measuring intensity, severity. And that's important also because that helps us know if we're helping people do better.
How do you differentiate, say, between normal depression, and depression is normal among most people to varying degrees, and post-traumatic stress syndrome? Is there a differentiation between the two?
So there's two. I mean, there's a lot of overlap. So people who will meet criteria for what we call major depression, which is a diagnosis, and PTSD would be, those are two different diagnoses, and a lot of times those will go together. But you sort of asked about just day-to-day depression and mood shift. And I think it's the fact that if you have a mood shift, feeling down, but that it's recoverable, that it's not preventing you from doing the things that matter in your life, it's, that's the difference. Are the symptoms preventing you from living a meaningful life, living the life you want to live? That's kind of the core thing we're looking for. And then we'll also see anxiety, right? People will get anxious about stuff. I mean, worry about how things are going to go that day. But is that worry preventing them from being able to function, be able to do the things that they need to do to have the life they want to live?
A couple of terms I ran across in doing some research: moral injury, relevant to PTSD, and conditioning. Can you talk with us a little bit about what those terms mean in your practice?
Sure. So let me start with conditioning. One of the things that's a really basic understanding of how human beings and all species function is by learning. And conditioning relates to learning. So there's two types of conditioning. There's classical conditioning. So people may know the story of Pavlov's dog, where a person, an animal pairs a kind of innocuous thing, in this case a bell, with a stimulus, food. And so when they hear the bell, it creates the same reaction that the food creates. Well, in PTSD, the stimulus, the pairing may be between something innocuous, let's say like driving on the road, and something incredibly intense like an explosion, an IED, an explosion. And so now you've paired driving with a threat that created huge physiological reaction. Now a person driving on the road may have that same physiological reaction. That's conditioning. You've conditioned the road to produce the same reaction that a bomb created for you when you were on deployment. Okay. The second type of conditioning is operant conditioning. And this is kind of how we learn. It's basically that when you do something and you either get a benefit from doing it or it eliminates a bad thing, you do that thing more, right? So an easy example here is like if you've put money into a vending machine and something comes out, you're likely to put money into that vending machine in the future again, right? So that's basic operant conditioning. You've learned that the vending machine gives you something if you put money in. The other thing that can happen is you learn that if you take an action, it stops something bad from happening. So what happens in PTSD in operant condition is what we will call as avoidance. What a person learns is that if they are having physiological reactions, if they avoid reminders, those become less intense. And so they stop doing things. And that makes perfect sense. And that's operant conditioning. What's the problem with that? The problem is that if you keep avoiding more and more in your life, you have a smaller and smaller and smaller life. And the other big problem with that is the way you extinguish that classical conditioning, that pairing of the explosion with, let's say, driving, is by doing the driving over and over and over. And that will extinguish the relationship with the physical symptoms. And that's a big part of treatment. We call it exposure treatment. But if you're avoiding, you're never extinguishing that relationship. And treatment, really, the big part of treatment is breaking the relationship between the traumatic experience and the things you want to do with your life. Does that make sense?
No, that does. And with that, we're going to take another brief pause here for a public service announcement, and then we'll come back for the last portion of our hour-long discussion here.
Veterans, when you're struggling, soon becomes later, becomes someday, becomes when. Don't wait. Reach out.
Find resources at va.gov/reach.
Welcome back to Interesting People. My name's Tom Lorenzen. I'm the host of this show at Chabot College in Hayward, California. My guest, Dr. John McQuaid from the Department of Veterans Affairs, who works is a lead figure in their Department of Psychology. We're talking about PTSD here, John, and we're talking about how things got elevated, particularly in the post-Vietnam era. And a lot of veterans came back. There's a term that popped up here called moral injury. And I know a lot of veterans were not treated well when they came back because of the controversy of the war. Can you talk about moral injury relevant to the veterans, particularly of Vietnam, but maybe other wars as well?
So moral injury is a term that's been recognized more recently that focuses on the sense of the individual, the veteran, having either themselves participated in something that is a profound violation of their own values, or witnessing something that fits into that experience as well. And you mentioned this in relation to the experience that some veterans had coming back where they were not welcomed in a way that was respectful and a value and felt judged, and that could exacerbate that experience of moral injury where folks are coming back from a war that was controversial and then have be stigmatized when they return, and that can exacerbate that sense. But the basic concept is one where the injury is one to one's sense of self and identity as a person of value, of person who has a certain moral core. And so treatment along that lines often will involve helping folks examine the reality of what they face, because one of the big challenges with trauma is, in retrospect, people will look back and say, well, I should have done something different, or I should have handled this. When in fact, oftentimes folks are dealing with things that are totally outside of their control, or things that are so shocking and overwhelming that it's very hard for anyone to react in a different way. And so that sort of internal judgment, that moral injury, is something where we're trying to develop new treatments or modify current treatments to be more effective in helping veterans with that issue.
Now, how common, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but how common would you say it would be for people in the military, particularly people that experience combat, or succumb to post-traumatic stress syndrome?
So, just before our talking, I was looking what we see in our National Center for PTSD. They find about 10% of veterans who come into VA for care meet criteria for PTSD. So that's probably a little bit higher than the general veteran population. I think the general community population is closer to 5% have PTSD. Amongst women in the military, it's higher, who come in for VA services. It's about 19% have PTSD for women coming into VA care. And again, in the community, that's somewhat lower in terms of the frequency.
I see. And how do you treat, once it's diagnosed, how do you treat it?
There are 3 primary psychotherapeutic interventions that are the top line treatments that the VA has reviewed and supported. They're called cognitive processing therapy.
Got a bug fly in there. Just landed on your forehead there.
Excuse me. Cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, and eye movement and desensitization, desensitization and reprocessing. The first 2 are primarily based on the principles we just talked about in terms of operant conditioning and classical conditioning. So cognitive processing therapy is helping people review the experience and then be able to reinterpret what they went through. And it's a structured therapeutic model and incorporates a fair amount of cognitive reframing. Prolonged exposure, very much as it described, is practicing exposure to the memories. You're repeatedly listening to one's memories and revisiting those so that the emotional response gets reduced so that people can tolerate the memories more effectively, and also going into the community and engaging in things that one's avoiding otherwise. And EMDR, which is has good outcome measures. The underlying mechanism is not as clear as to why that model works, but it really is I would describe as an eclectic model that incorporates components of multiple different models, including exposure, relaxation, cognitive reframing. It also has the eye movement, or the idea is like a tracking a stimulus while reprocessing information is hypothesized to facilitate reintegration of those memories into one's identity in a way that reduces the stress. So those are the models that are the most common. We also have a broad range of other services. We have certainly pharmacotherapy. Psychotherapy is the top line treatment for PTSD, interestingly enough. The medications are often an adjunct to psychotherapy. And then we will incorporate other aspects of how to help people recover, including recreation therapy and work and other factors to help people have a full life.
Huh. That's very interesting. And as we sort of move aside from that, and the very difficult thing, and there's been a lot of stories in the media and the press about this, and that is the high suicide rate among veterans. And it's been rather shocking to most of us in the public to find out about it. Can you address that subject with us? Why that is happening, and also how it's treated? How do you try and prevent suicide, and how do you deal with it from the Veterans Administration standpoint?
So the why is a tough question. I think there are some things that we make assumptions about. One is that one of the things we found is combat exposure doesn't necessarily elevate suicide risk, and PTSD doesn't necessarily elevate suicide risk. The highest risk populations for suicide in the general community are older men with substance use disorders and access to guns and health problems. Those are the factors that play out. And that, in some ways, describes our veteran population, even though we think about kind of our more recent combat veterans. The veteran population is an older veteran population with multiple health problems. Oftentimes there's access to substance use, and veterans are very familiar with firearms and own firearms at a higher rate and tend to be more likely to be isolated. So all those factors increases the risk for suicide. The other thing that's really painful in serving veterans is that women veterans have a significantly higher rate of suicide completion than women in the general community. And there are a number of factors to that, which could include exposure to more trauma, and particularly military sexual trauma and challenges in the service, but also that women veterans are more familiar and likely to use a firearm in attempting suicide than individuals in the general population. And we do know that in the general population, women are much less likely to use firearms, and if you don't use a firearm, you're much more likely to survive. And so the fact that women veterans use firearms at a much higher rate place them at much higher risk for completing suicide.
Well, it's I read recently in an article, I think it was in USA Today, that more veterans have died in the last 6-7 years of suicide than from any military experience, whether Afghanistan or Iraq. And so you're indicating it's because of maybe the aging process in particular, and health issues that emerge separate from the military experience that are sort of natural in the aging process?
I think it's a combination. I think certainly one of the other big risk factors for veterans specifically is actually transition from military to civilian life. It is in that transition that we have the highest rates of suicide, regardless of combat exposure. And a couple of things that play into that, and I'm going to do a little bit of speculation here. I think the data are still not completely clear. But military culture provides a lot of structure and a lot of mission and a lot of meaning. And a lot of veterans find that hard to replicate in civilian life. And that transition can be very, very difficult for individuals. And so one of the things that we've done, and actually in combination with the Department of Defense, is really focus on those places where there's the highest risk. So the VA is doing more to reach out to veterans as soon as they're transitioning out of the military to provide support. Veterans have free health care, immediately after, who are eligible for care, have free health care in the VA immediately after that period. Other things that the VA has done is, for example, we found that veterans were avoiding going in for emergency services because they were afraid about the cost. And so the VA, if a veteran goes in for suicidal risk or suicidal concerns into an emergency room in the community, the VA will pay for that. So that we want to remove barriers for veterans from getting care. The National Suicide Hotline, there's of course, 988. So if anybody's, that's the number for everybody. If people don't take anything else away, take away 988, which is the number for the National Suicide Hotline. Press 1 for veteran. There's a national network of extremely skilled and knowledgeable professionals waiting to take that call, and they can get a veteran connected to healthcare services and mental health services in their location within 24 hours. So if a veteran calls that crisis line, is in crisis, but doesn't need to be immediately hospitalized or served, that hotline will then contact the local VA, who will reach out within the next 24 hours to that veteran to make sure they get the care they need.
That's interesting. I didn't know it was 988.
988.
Well, with that, we're nearing the end of the discussion here, John, and might want to look into the camera and say, talking to people out there that are veterans, and as they may need to access medical care, psychological care, what advice do you give to people out there that have served in the U.S. military?
I strongly encourage any veteran to contact your local VA and reach out and find out what services may be available to you. I think there are hundreds of thousands of professionals who want to be there for you and support you. And we are here. I think of us as the VA as the manifestation of this nation's mission to honor the service that you provided. And we take a huge amount of pride in that and take that mission to our heart. So I really hope folks will reach out and access the VA. And I'll repeat that number. If people are in crisis, please use that crisis line number 988 and press 1 for veteran. And they can also help get veterans connected to care.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you for being on the program today and for your service, too, in the Department of Veterans Affairs and what you do to help our veterans all around the country. And it's a very noble service that you do for everybody.
Well, it's an honor to be part of it. So thank you so much for the time and to share.
Well, thank you for being on the show, John.
For veterans needing immediate assistance, help is available for you. Call the Veterans Crisis Line at 988. That's 988. For those who prefer texting, send a message to 838255 or chat online at the Veterans Crisis Line website. For non-emergency assistance, the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, is here to help. Call 1-800-827-1000 for general information and support with benefits, health care, and other services. Remember, you're not alone. Reach out today.